To be quite frank, it doesn't necessarily matter how we measure the Chinese economy relative to the US economy, whether it's by GDP per capita, which the US far outpaces China, or nominal GDP, which the US is number one and China's number two, or purchasing power parity, in which China's number one versus number two. And this is because we can't get a good gauge on what the Chinese economy actually encompasses from a GDP perspective. And the vast majority of the studies and statistics, even coming out of China, point to their GDP is inflated. Now, the first reason the Chinese GDP is inflated is because of their capital controls. And by capital controls, I mean their restriction on money exiting their country. So when you can't take your money and go somewhere else, you don't want to necessarily just let it sit. So you just, by default, invest in China. Their capital controls have inflated their GDP artificially. If China were to lift these capital controls, which they're not going to be, the currency and their economy would fall very fast, because this money, which is stuck in China's investments, in bank accounts, in travelers' checks, savings deposits, money market accounts, even small-time deposits under 100,000, and shares in stock and such, that would outflow. That would leave, because China is seen as less safe. It's a less safe haven for many investors. Capital controls have been preventing that capital flight, is what it's called, that investment from leaving. Thus, it's remained in China and artificially elevated the GDP. The second issue was discovered by a multiple year study conducted by the Brookings Institute, where they found that China's economy is about 12% smaller than official figures indicated. They also discovered that China has been overstating its annual growth by 2% every year. This was reflected again when China recently admitted that they overcounted their population by 100 million people. So their economy could be 15 to 20% smaller than they previously stated. This comes from the Chinese government's emphasis on numerical targets. They focus on ensuring that everything continues to grow, whether it's population right now because they're in a demographic crisis, and I'll talk about that in a bit, or it's their GDP. They're politically sensitive figures. They want those numbers to look good. So the Chinese Communist Party evaluates the regions and the local governments, who then distribute that evaluation downward. They evaluate the performance based largely on, hey, are you growing? Are you getting bigger? And if they aren't, you're removed from positions. So since local governments are rewarded for meeting growth and investment targets and punished for not, there's clearly an incentive to skew the local statistics. And this was a study that was conducted by the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, as well as the U.S. National Bureau of Economic Research. Don't worry, I'm going to get to some Chinese sources here in a bit too. For years, the sum of China's provincial GDP has exceeded the national figure, which is a clear sign of statistical inflation at the local level. There's no way that all of the combined states can combine to create a GDP, and then suddenly the Chinese Communist Party is saying that theirs is lower, because the inflation rate was, the inflation of numbers, the faking of numbers was so big that even the Chinese government didn't believe it and had to artificially reduce them by whatever arbitrary percentage. In 2017, the Chinese government published a paper and actually accused three provinces in China of flat out fabricating data. Completely fabricating it. Likely because they didn't have very good numbers, so they just needed to fabricate the data. This was all before COVID, when the fabrication of data became more rampant because they stopped reporting things completely, unless it was good news. So when you talk about China's purchasing power parity or its GDP or any of those economic measures, it's not as strong as people think. But here's my second point. None of this matters. Not one iota of this matters going forward, because China's population is going to drop by 400 to 700 million by 2070. This was discovered by a study from the Jiatong University in China. This is Chinese data. Meanwhile, the US is going to grow by 50 million by then. When the US population grows, the economy grows. The GDP grows. That's how it works. When you lose half your population in the next 50 years, that's an economic death sentence. Now, the University of Washington is a bit more optimistic of China, saying that China's population won't halve until 2100. So they won't lose 700 million until 2100. But that's not the date we have to be focusing on. Due to the disparity in older welfare recipients versus the lack of young people that support them, these numbers were before the 100 million miscount. This was all data that came out before China said, oops, we miscounted. We overestimated 100 million people because, again, we reward our provinces for reporting we have this many births and we have made this much GDP. China discovered they had a $100 million or 100 million person false surplus of people. Pew Research data shows that in 15 years, 60% of the Chinese population will be 65 years old. The US, in 15 years, their population will be roughly 20%, will be 65. When 60% of your population is retirement age, that is unsustainable completely, especially when they are a larger welfare state than the United States. In the US, we are bolstered by not only we do have a higher birth rate amongst Americans, but also immigration. China doesn't have as big of an immigration base as we do. They're largely standoffish when it comes to people immigrating to their country because they don't want outside ideas. So basically, this is an unsolvable problem for the Chinese. Make no mistake, China will collapse, and Russia is facing a similar problem. No matter what the GDP numbers say now, no country has ever experienced their population being cut in half and survived. China is no different. The US, with its demographic strength, its geographic stability, its access to resources, and its global interconnectedness, is going to continue to grow. China, if it hasn't already, will peak soon. And there's nothing China can do about it. And that's the bottom line.